Hello, I'm Cameron Cooper, editor of the Law Management Journal. The journal is proudly published by the Australian Law Management Group, a committee of the Legal Practice section of the Law Council of Australia. ALMG is releasing a series of podcasts. They're designed to help law firms navigate the introduction of new anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing obligations. The new laws will come into force in Australia on July 1, 2026. In the fourth podcast of our series, we speak to Claire Pedley, a risk and compliance team leader at Verlata Consulting, and also Con Poptodorov, a director at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, who leads their fraud and compliance team. In this interview, they tell law firm consultant Trish Carroll, an ALMG committee member, how firms can use technology and the latest software to handle their AML compliance and bring down costs at the same time. We begin the interview with reflections on key elements of the new AML rules.
What do you regard as the key AML CTF obligations that law firms will need technology and data to help manage?
So I think that the key would be around record keeping. So record keeping will allow the firm to, when it comes to verification of identity, source of funds, ultimate beneficial ownership, and ongoing due diligence, it's crucial that firms can record that information and have that readily available. So that's where technology is absolutely key. When it comes to client onboarding and aligning the firm's compliance program, looking at notifications, escalations, approvals, these are all things that technology can assist with workflows. So looking at the workflows that an AML solution has available and looking at what can be automated to make AML practices more efficient. And finally, when it comes to the obligations, essentially as part of that, the firm needs to be able to recreate the transaction for 7 years after that transaction or service has concluded. So if the AML practices are quite manual, that can be extremely difficult to find that information.
So I expect that a lot of that information is already captured. So in your experience, what data are firms likely to already hold that supports AML compliance, and where do you expect the gaps to be?
So firms should already hold the basics, such as the client's full name, their address. If they're a conveyancing firm, they'll already be verifying identity documents, most likely through a biometrics provider like Apply ID or GBG. As the firm goes through a conflict of interest process and reviewing those, they will have identified other parties that are involved in the transaction or service, but not necessarily all of the ultimate beneficial owners. So that's where there could be gaps in that information. They will also need to collect a source of wealth, source of funds, and that's not generally information that is collected at the moment.
What would you see as being the best way for law firms to assess whether the existing client data is accurate? And you've identified a lot of the gaps, but also just how it's structured and how usable it would be for compliance purposes.
Look, I would suggest look at what reporting is available from your practice management system to review the state of your data at the moment. So how dirty is it? How clean is it? Firms are finding that data cleansing forms a natural part of an AML project, especially when implementing AML software and looking at the data migration process. So general issues that are coming up as part of that is duplicate client records, which can happen through acquisition, missing phone numbers, email addresses, postal addresses, old details, for example, and an old address prior to purchase of a new property and the practice management system hasn't been updated. So, and there's benefits of cleaning up your data as well outside of the AML process. So you can do accurate EDMs, mail outs, making sure they go to the right place. And also with the progressive AI tools that are now available in the market, it's important that those tools are referencing accurate information. There's also obviously privacy obligations with PII data. So it's so important that the information is accurate. So looking at how you can improve the structure of your data, again, look at your practice management system and what that can do with drop downs or date pickers, mandatory fields, address finders. This will all help in the long run as you try and progress towards having cleaner data. With structure, look at your email filing. Is there a consistent way to file your emails? Look at naming conventions for your documents so you can find them easier. And then with your data, looking at labels for your data, so tagging that sensitive data. You can also look at information governance solutions in the market like ActiveNav that discover where all your data is, both structured and unstructured. And then you can start to work with that and look at, well, actually, how bad is this? So those information governance solutions do give you a really good idea.
So clearly technology is an important aspect of this. And I'm interested to know, particularly from you, Con, what firms should look for when evaluating AML software?
Choosing technology can be a complex task. So if we were to prioritize to maybe the top three, I would say quality, flexibility, and traceability. Quality obviously always matters, but it is particularly important where we're working with data. For example, external data sources such as PEPs and sanctions that are high quality, curated, and frequently updated, as well as sophisticated matching and false positive reduction methods can directly impact the outcomes and operational effort associated with compliance. Now, when we talk about flexibility, we need to think that regulations and firms themselves evolve, and any technology that the firm chooses needs to be also able to evolve. And this ability to keep up with evolving regulations and business challenges is important to stay on top of any compliance tasks. And finally, talking about traceability, which also Claire mentioned previously, in regulatory context, the firm needs to be able to explain any decisions at any point in time and go back to understand what they have done. And this is crucial for any system to maintain. Now, it all, of course, depends on size and complexity. A smaller firm will have probably a less of a challenge in this area, but large and complex organizations will need systems that are able to maintain all these three, in my opinion. If I should add two more, to be more precise, I will definitely add explainability that goes in hand with traceability. Again, allowing the business to be able to explain their processes and outcomes at any time, and especially in the context of advanced technologies like AI-driven approaches. And finally, usability, whereas this could be somewhat subjective, I think there are common standards for usability, and ultimately a solution needs to be enabling the users and not necessarily posing an additional challenge to them.
Well, a very topical point, that last one, given the current hoo-ha about the Bureau of Meteorology's website's unusability. So it seems like a very important point. How much of the compliance process, in your opinion, such as client due diligence, the KYC checks, transaction monitoring and reporting, how much do you think can realistically be automated?
I think the short answer is quite a lot. Now, in realistic terms, it will vary depending on the, again, size and complexity of the organization. But from initial risk assessment to onboarding, customer identification, more sophisticated platform-based approaches and orchestration approaches can be taken to take different paths depending on the customer risk, type of service, and so forth. And that goes through transaction monitoring, and even management of hits and referrals, and regular reporting can be automated to a high degree with the introduction, for example, of AI agents. But again, the question is, just because we can do something, do we really have to do it? And the answer needs to be right for the organization itself, for the size and complexity of the business. Some firms may be able to just resort to simple lookup methods using, for example, a web browse solution to look up for PEPs and sanctions, whereas others will need to deploy more advanced automated approaches, which will increase their productivity. So again, it is important to find the right solution for the type of firm you're running, and there is something for everyone out there.
So from a risk management perspective and tasks such as ID verification, how can technology take some of the subjectivity out of that? How can technology assist in risk management with some of those key tasks, particularly, for example, with potentially long-time clients where there's a little bit of apprehension about interrogating too deeply?
First of all, I think technology is essential for the compliance process these days. We just can't complete all these tasks manually. We don't have access to the right data sources. We can't go and search one by one. So there's got to be some involvement of technology. But a different aspect is introducing that data-based assessment, which is important. The fact that you've known a client for a long time doesn't mean that they're not posing a risk and you may not be aware of it. And technology is helping you to make that judgment call with a degree of objectivity that otherwise you may not have, because you may not have access, for example, to the right information or right information sources. But also these days, technology has become much better at detecting some patterns and behaviors than humans are. And that is why it is indispensable in making those decisions. A simple example could be, how able are you to tell if an ID document has been manipulated? Now, if you're not a professional working in this area, it is likely that you may not spot it, whereas there are technologies out that are able to identify forgeries with a high degree of confidence. And again, this takes out the human factor and it takes out the bias and enables you to make better quality decisions.
What about, one of the things, and we've got a lot of listeners who are from smaller firms with limited budgets, are there other ways of going about this from a data strategy perspective that are available to them? And I'm conscious, particularly Claire, I understand Verlata works with 500 firms, and you've been a general manager of a law firm yourself.
Yeah.
Putting that hat on, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, depending on the size of the firm, there's several solutions and strategies that could be considered. So looking at those smaller firms who are on more limited budgets, a key is to, again, look at the practice management system and look at what opportunities are available with that. So hopefully there is a way to add custom data so that those key records can be collected within the practice management system. So those key records being the verification records, other parties that are involved, source of wealth information, ultimate beneficial owners, then looking at the standard due diligence versus enhanced, what checks the firm had considered as part of that, like PEP checks. So hopefully these can be added into the practice management system if they're not already in there. There could be a cost-effective module that could be added on that a smaller firm is unaware of. It could be in the roadmap and their practice management system just hasn't quite got there to telling them yet. So I think open up those discussions and conversations with your PMS provider to see what is available to you that could be a lower cost solution. Also look at what verification solutions are available in the market, like InfoTrack and Apply ID. I think I've mentioned that one. That could provide some solutions around workflows and efficiencies that may not necessarily be in the practice management system, but will still have those smaller firms being defensible come 1 July next year. Within your practice management system, when it comes to looking at what data strategies could help, look at that structured data again to streamline how those AML workflows operate. So looking at those, a big one I find is those mandatory fields, because that's how you can control what people are entering, and that saves you having that missing information. Looking at automatic reminders for ongoing client due diligence is another great solution. So hopefully for those smaller firms, there is opportunity to utilise their practice management system and maybe add on an EIV solution that can just make that, have them be defensible come 1 July next year and not blow their budget.
I mean, so in some ways, it sounds like a good opportunity to do some things that they haven't previously done. And certainly in my experience, a lot of firms don't like mandatory fields because it means that they have to be completed, but
Yes.
using them is going to really make a big difference. So I think that's a great tip. And I guess, Con, when you mentioned about flexibility as regulation and firms evolve, looking at these systems that will stand up. So I guess one of the things really that Claire said is, you can look at your practice management system and see how capable it is of evolving. But I'm interested, Con, to understand from you, how would a firm assess that attribute in the selection of software? So when you spoke about quality, flexibility, traceability, how do they go about assessing the flexibility of the solution that they're considering?
That's a great question. I believe that what we see today from legislation point of view is just the starts, and obligations are going to evolve and effectively increase. That's the reality. And that means that also organizations will have to be able to keep up with those regulations. At the same time, firms also don't remain static. They evolve, they scale up and down. It's just depending on what business challenges are ahead of them. And that's why technology that's supporting them also needs to be able to evolve together with those processes that are independent. And the way I would look at flexibility and also scalability is from two sides. Yes, we need to look at technology. I'll talk about this in a minute, but also from resourcing point of view. So on the side of the business, on the side of organization. And that means being able to allocate the right people to the right tasks at the right time. And again, technology can support this. But what I would look in technology is the ability to scale workflows up and down, the ability to put clients and other tasks through different workflows depending on, for example, the risk rating or the type of service you're providing, the ability to change technologies relatively easily. So a platform approach, for example, would allow you to change those backing technologies that you've been using to maybe something that's more modern or addresses new challenges. And at the same time, has the ability to scale up and down as, again, the business scales in different direction. So I think flexibility and scalability are both key, both on technology and the side of the business.
And are there any innovations on the horizon that you think could reshape AML compliance?
Well, everyone is talking about AI these days, and financial crime compliance is not an exception. And what you may see and hear in this context quite often is so-called agentic AI. So that's the use of AI agents to automate and make autonomous decisions on certain processes. That could include customer due diligence, transaction monitoring, or management of referrals, where these agents, again, can make autonomous decisions how to proceed in certain circumstances, even to the degree that they can interact with each other. But at the same time, there are also other processes where AI has been playing a role that many of you may or may not be aware of. For example, in identity verification, when we are talking about AI challenges, they're on both sides. On the sides of the criminal community, where we are facing with a lot of occurrences or increased occurrence of deepfakes or AI-driven document forgeries, but also on the side of verifying identities and combating criminal activity, where AI technologies can be introduced to train large data sets and remove bias, for example, from biometric face recognition technology. So I think it is a very large subject that we can probably have a podcast dedicated to separately. But also, I think even, I wouldn't say necessarily simple, but other techniques like, again, using platform and orchestration-based approaches, also relatively new concepts. And data sharing as such in a consortia-like setting between organizations, which is also increasingly mandated by different legislation, is a challenge that we need to see technology addressing in the future.
And that's certainly something that the CEO of Austrac referred to. That sharing is just extremely important. And I guess another thing that the CEO said was the importance of using the suspicious notification, that's a really important element of AUSTRAC being able to assess whether that particular entity's suspicions have been notified. He mentioned a number of, I think it was 1,000 suspicious notifications a day. So that, the data set is huge, which I guess brings us to the point of how technology can really help a firm in the case of a potential breach. Claire, you've mentioned structure and traceability, the need to recreate the transaction. And even though the CEO of AUSTRAC, in fact, said, well, for some firms, they won't really need more than a paper-based system if they're very small. I think your point about how do you recreate that if the paper system hasn't been very good to start with. So how do you see technology really helping firms deal with potential breaches?
So I think there's several ways that technology can help around ease of accessing the information and the importance of having structured data, having strong reporting available. So when you are looking at AML solutions in the market, look at what their reporting suites are like to make sure that you can actually get that information reasonably easily and make sure it meets requirements. Most AML solutions have free audit access as well. So auditors should be able to go into the solution and look at exactly what they need. So that's a huge bonus when it comes to audits and technology for firms. And then also, if there is a breach, look at, from a future-proofing point of view, looking at the risk of trying to avoid those by aligning AML software like Spinnaker, for example, as closely as possible to your compliance program. So that's where, depending on the size and complexity of the firm, will then be relative to what solution is out there in the market that aligns nicely to the firm's needs and requirements, looking at low, medium, high risk, and then what solutions will work nicely with that. Because ultimately, technology should make things simpler. That's the whole idea. And AML at the moment is incredibly overwhelming. That's not going to change anytime soon. So as much as possible, making sure the solutions are intuitive and, as I mentioned, align with the compliance program. So ultimately, that safeguards AML practices moving forward.
I'm sort of reminded of, in years gone past where organisations wouldn't really get their compliance act together until the proverbial hit the fan. So what's your view about firms resisting spending what's needed to achieve AML compliance with the relative ease of ongoing use that you've mentioned? What's your view about doing that now as opposed to waiting and seeing, from a cost-effective perspective and a reputational perspective?
So I think workflows create efficiencies. So when it comes to high volumes like conveyancing, for a firm trying to do that without a good technology solution, it's going to be incredibly time consuming to collect the additional requirements that they're not collecting at the moment, like source of wealth, ultimate beneficial ownership, and standard due diligence versus enhanced ongoing due diligence. So with conveyancing being high volumes, any time savings that can be made across them create significant annual cost savings and efficiencies. So that's, I think, a key consideration. Looking at those notification and approval processes that will create cost-effective solutions as well. And then again, going back to that record keeping, that's just key. And this is where technology helps, as we've mentioned a few times, being able to recreate the transaction or service provided. And then finally, less workarounds with technology. Build in your risk scores into the AML solution and look at what risk questions you've used as part of assessing the risk for your firm and see how they can be built into the AML solution as well. Again, taking as much of the subjective nature away from AML practices and making things easy for users and for firms, that's where technology can really play a part.
And I think, Con, when we were speaking before, you mentioned some research that evidences spending on the right technologies at the right time will actually reduce compliance costs. Can you speak to your experience with that?
That is exactly what we found. We, LexisNexis Risk Solutions, are business active globally. And as such, we carry out a lot of research activity among our user base to understand their needs, their processes, and how they do work. And relatively recently, a couple of years ago, we did a piece of research around the cost of financial crime compliance. And we found that on macroeconomic scale, it costs businesses billions to stay on top of their compliance challenges. And the top two contributing factors were the cost on people. So that would be talent, which I think is as expected. And the second biggest contributor was technology. But what we've also found was that organizations that spend on the right technology or choose to invest into technology for all the benefits that Claire mentioned earlier actually are spending less on average than their peers or comparable types of organizations, comparable types of businesses in the same area. So all I can say is that investing in technology is worthwhile, not only because of enabling you to fulfill your obligations or protecting your reputation and ultimately potentially generating more business opportunities, because I would like to believe that everyone wants to do business with an organization that's compliant. But at the same time, actually, it will help you keep your costs down long term.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think you've made some really incredible points there, which are going to be useful to our listeners, no matter the size of their firm. And I guess the real challenge is to get onto it, get started now. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah, get those conversations underway.
Thank you. Thank you, Trish and Claire.
Cheers.